Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Canterbury Earthquake Response and Recovery Bill be now read a third time. Mr Speaker, firstly I want to compliment all members on the very constructive debate that occurred over the committee stages of this bill, particularly given the very difficult issues that we confront with the recovery and reconstruction of New Zealand's second largest city after what I think will go down in history as New Zealand's most costly natural disaster. Mr Speaker, I want to compliment the Minister, Jerry Brownlee, on the work that he has put in over the last 10 days. Mr Brownlee, like other members, and I acknowledge Brendan Burns, Amy Adams, are members of this House whose own property has been severely damaged in this earthquake, and the way in which both those members and the Minister has worked cooperatively to bring this legislation to the House so quickly, I think is a great credit to him and to the other members. It's interesting, Mr Speaker, to reflect on the debate in this chamber in April of 1931 in response to the tragic Napier earthquake that my colleague Chris Tremaine mentioned in the committee stages. On that occasion it took 3 months for legislation to come before the Parliament to help the community of Napier respond to that earthquake, and it's a credit, I believe, to have legislation brought together so quickly in just 10 days, 80 years later, to respond to this issue. Mr Speaker, I also want to acknowledge particularly my own officials from the Ministry for the Environment have been working incredibly long hours since the middle of last week as it rapidly became very obvious that the existing legislative framework was going to be a barrier to Canterbury's recovery, and the way in which they worked through the course of the weekend as we brought this bill together. I think it's quite important to put on record a couple of points about the legislation. There has been the odd extravagant comment about the bill's intent. I want to reinforce that orders in Council are only permitted under this legislation that directly relate to the recovery and the response to the Canterbury earthquake. Those that claim this bill will allow any act of any Parliament to be changed for any purpose is not correct, and in fact would be open to judicial review if there were attempts to bypass acts that were not related to that massive earthquake in Canterbury. I want to comment on a number of the amendments that the House considered. I'd note that the Minister, Jerry Brownlee, did accept amendments where there was a good case, particularly with respect to the intent of the government to ensure that the Commission in charge in overlooking the recovery of Canterbury for the earthquake should be subject to the Official Information Act. And that is an amendment that arose during the committee stages, has been changed. But let me go through some of the amendments that the government did not accept and the reasons for it. Firstly, there were proposals to limit the jurisdiction of this Act, or this bill as it stands, only to those issues in the Waimak, Christchurch and Selwyn district and city. Can I say that does not make sense? It does not make sense because the impacts of this earthquake have gone well beyond that. We've got people working round the clock trying to reopen State Highway 1 and the main trunk railway in Kaikoura that's outside that jurisdiction of those areas. We have damage to chimneys and to buildings that goes well into actually every one of the 10 districts through Canterbury. And it might be sensible. It's one of the issues I'm considering as Minister for the Environment. Given the number of fatalities that have occurred historically around earthquakes and chimneys, and the fact that I think this House shares a desire to improve the air quality of Canterbury, it may be proper for us to pass some extra orders in council to ensure that wherever possible we eliminate the chimneys and move Christchurch, Ashburton and other communities to cleaner air quality. So I don't believe there is a robust case for limiting the jurisdiction of this bill simply to those 3 districts, because quite frankly the issues go beyond there. There's been the proposition that this only cover those acts that have been specifically identified. And we had a pretty hard crack at trying to identify and being upfront with the Parliament about the acts that we think we would need to move around. And obviously the Resource Management Act, the Building Act, the acts that deal with the Earthquake Commission, and those will require some orders in Council. But I have to say to you, when you look at the acts of Parliament that govern the region of Canterbury, you've got the Summit Road, you've got acts for the University of Canterbury, you've got acts that specifically deal with Christ College, acts that deal with the Christchurch Littleton Tunnel, there are specific acts around port companies. It was not possible in the very short period in which we need to respond to the need of the people of Canterbury to specifically list and identify every one of those acts, and that is why it's important that this bill has this flexibility. It's been suggested that we need to specifically list in this bill the skills of the commissioners, and a bit of a crack, and in the time frame, I don't necessarily disagree with the proposals that were put forward, albeit I'd note that one of the most important skills is going to be ensure that we rebuild Canterbury and Christchurch so that it might be more resilient to a future earthquake, which I say is highly probable in future, particularly for the infrastructure and the buildings that are going to be rebuilt. And so I don't think it is a wise move to be quite specific about those skills, albeit, frankly, we take on board the views that the opposition have expressed around that skill set. I'm not necessarily disagreeing that they are relevant in those appointments. There's been amendments to add extra representation from Christchurch on the Commission. I don't think we should take a view that the Commission is representative. If you want to run the argument that, for instance, Christchurch have additional commissioners, I have to say that the scale of the earthquake and so on was very large. The member who represents Waimak and Kate Wilkinson has also played the scale of the impact on Kaipoi. And having seen some of that firsthand, there's no doubt that there has been a massive impact in that area. I think it's important that each of those territorial authorities certainly have a voice on the Commission. Starting doubling them up, I think that we do not necessarily get this Commission onto the right footing for the recovery. There's been objections to the issue of retrospectivity. I have to tell you, let's be pragmatic here. It is my view that there will need to be an element of retrospectivity to some of the changes that are going to be necessary to make the recovery as smooth as possible, and that is why we need to take a pragmatic view. Mr. Speaker, there may be need for this Parliament to consider further legislation as we work through the humongous issues associated with the recovery from the earthquake in Canterbury. But to have this bill in place as early as now to enable the government to get the Commission up and running is what this Parliament needs to do in responding to Canterbury's hour of need. This is about providing a short, sharp response that enables us to be able to move from the civil emergency that has been exceptionally well handled quickly into the recovery phase and make sure that there is not a business or a household that is delayed for a day further than what is absolutely necessary to enable it to recover. Yes, there's been some debate about this legislation making a provision for 18 months. Quite frankly, my view is 18 months is on the best knowledge, my view, at this point 10 days post-event, that it is going to take for Christchurch to recover. That may change. It may be longer. I suspect it's more likely to be out the longer end. And if we look at similar communities, whether it be San Francisco, Kobe or other areas that have suffered massive earthquakes, my view is that 18 months is a realistic period. Mr. Speaker, again, I commend this bill to the House. I thank members for their constructive contribution. It is what we need to do as a Parliament to give Canterbury the capacity to recover as quickly as possible from this massive quake.